This is Great Westerners, Programme 2, The British Schindler. File mix stereo.
But for the activities of this saintly man, we wouldn't be here today, and I would be a statistic in the Holocaust.
My parents and I, we owed our life to Major Foley. There's no other way of looking at it.
Uncovered at the end of the Second World War was perhaps the 20th century's worst act of genocide. 6 million Jews lost their lives at the hands of the Nazis.
Foley even hid Jews in his house. It's estimated that he saved tens of thousands of people from the Holocaust.
This is the untold story of a Somerset man who some say did more for the Jews than Oskar Schindler, and yet many people in his hometown of Highbridge don't even know his name. He was an MI6 spy working undercover as head of the British Passport Office in Berlin. Francis Edward Foley risked life and limb helping Jews escape persecution from Nazi Germany.
Foley was born in 1884. He was born into a Catholic family. His father was a railway engineer, and he was brought up really according to his mother's wishes as a very, very strict Catholic.
Foley grew up in this small terraced house near his father's work on the Somerset and Dorset Railway. During the 1890s, he went to the old St John's School in Highbridge. With his mother's encouragement, Foley left for France to train as a priest. Then, after university, he embarked on a career in teaching. But when war broke out in 1914, Foley signed up to fight for his country. Following the declaration of peace, however, he trained to become a spy. The continuing military threat from Germany meant that in 1920, Foley was sent to Berlin undercover as head of the British Passport Control Office.
Berlin was really a pretty exciting place at this time. It was the centre, one of the main cultural centres of Europe. Foley spent the day in a back room at the Passport Control Office, obviously writing his intelligence reports, but equally he's going out and meeting people on the street, and that becomes a very, very dangerous problem there, because he's supposed to keep him with the local police, but at the same time he's actually spying on the country.
In June 1921, he married, and his wife Kay joined him in Germany.
Frank Foley throughout was always in the office. He was always cheerful and terribly laid back, as if nothing worried him, but very concerned and very kind to people, and it was a kindness that people felt immediately. You could trust this man. He would do all he could to help you.
Following the war, Germany was struggling to pay back billions of pounds in compensation to the Allies. Out of this discontent grew a new political party, which was led by an Austrian called Adolf Hitler. His 1925 book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, described Jews as vermin and blamed them for the nation's troubles. Over the next few years, the Nazis made huge electoral gains in Germany's parliament, and by January 1933, Hitler finally gained the position of Chancellor of the Third Reich.
At school they taught us that the German Aryan race were descended from blue-eyed geese, while the rest of mankind descended from apes. And we learned that Jesus was not a Jew. His family were Aryan immigrants to Palestine.
One day I came home with a swastika in my school book, and my mother said, how did that get in here? And I said, don't, that's a very bad, I was 6 or 7. It's a very bad sign, and she explained what it meant.
And you could buy sweeties.
Oh yes, we had, there was a tuck shop, and they had little sweets with the center, which used to be round, had the swastika inside.
This rise in anti-Semitism meant more work for the British consulate. Despite the government's reluctance to encourage immigration, Foley wrote to London in March of 1933.
This office is overwhelmed with applications from Jews to proceed to Palestine, to England, to anywhere in the British Empire. Professional men of the highest standing, including some who were wounded on the German side during the war, have consulted me with regard to emigration.
Just days later, the Nazis launched a nationwide boycott of all Jewish businesses.
We started seeing signs that Jews were not wanted, the Jews and dogs were not wanted, and equally Jewish shops were painted over with Stars of David painted on them to avoid other people shopping there. Well, I remember once I was going to the barber, so the barber's assistant, the young boy didn't want to cut my hair, but so the barber did it himself.
At the Nuremberg rally in 1935, new laws were introduced which meant that Jews could no longer marry non-Jews. They were thrown out of businesses and sacked from public services. This even affected Germany's leading eye specialist, Professor Oskar Fehr.
When the new Nuremberg laws came out, he had to leave the public hospital, Rudolf Virchow Hospital, but only a couple of years earlier he had a letter from the Lord Mayor of Berlin wishing him a happy birthday and hoping his valuable service to the town would be going on for many years to come.
Frank Foley was now becoming increasingly worried for Jews in Germany. He warned the authorities in another dispatch back to London.
German policy is clearly to eliminate the Jew from German life, and the Nazis do not mind how this is accomplished. Mortality and emigration provide the means.
I was kicked, saying, "You Jewish bitch, you don't belong here." And I fell down all those steps, and I tore a ligament in my ankle, and I was unwell for weeks and weeks.
Susan Meyer-Michael was the daughter of a well-known sculptor and potter. Her sister remembers when they were no longer welcome in their hometown of Raida.
My father got a letter from high above to say that they would not want him to do any more works of art because they were too Jewish. They were not they did not conform to the ideology of National Socialism. Well, that sort of thing didn't help him to want to stay.
One night, Wolfgang Meyer-Michael had a visit from the SS.
That is when my father started to get his things together and to find out where he could go. And you see, he tried to emigrate to America, but he didn't have the necessary certificate, which is a visa. He tried to come to England, and he wrote to Wedgwood as a potter. And Wedgwood wrote back and said, "We can't employ you, we have unemployment here." He was not a synagogue goer or anything like that. So he wanted to go to Palestine. You could only get a visa if you were an industrialist or an agricultural worker. You couldn't if you were an artist. You needed a Kapitalisten certificate.
By this time, Sabina's father was becoming desperate. He turned to the British consulate in Berlin for help.
He met Frank Foley, whom he hadn't met before. He didn't know who he was. He was very, very kind to him. Kept him there for an hour, although people were queuing around the block, and talked to him about art and pottery and his future and all the rest of it. And then he said, "Mr. Meyer-Michael, I cannot give you a visa without you paying £1,000. And my father said, I don't know how to raise it. I cannot. And Mr. Foley said, "Surely, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there must be somebody who would give you such a letter. You can let him give you a letter to say that he will lend you £1,000, and you give him a letter back saying you won't use them. Surely there must be someone." Now, my father knew full well that this was going to be a ruse, but he couldn't even think of anyone. He went away and thought of a cousin of his who had made it to Holland. He went back to Mr. Foley, who said, "Yeah, what did I tell you?" And within half an hour, he had, my father writes in his memoirs, I had that precious document in my hand. And I'll never, ever forget Mr. Foley. He was so charming and so humane.
The Meyer-Michaels packed to leave Germany and set off for Palestine in April 1936. Their daughters, Sabina and Susan, followed later.
We were very sad because we had to part with our toys. We knew we would never see our garden or the things we were used to, you know.
Sad because we had to also lose our friends. We had to say goodbye. Going into the unknown.
He was just a very kind, very pleasant man who put you at your ease immediately. And if there was any fuss or bother, and there were some people who burst in a terrible nervous state, he was always able to calm them down, say, "Now have a seat and we'll see what we can do." And they did settle down. I mean, it was terrible circumstances. Some of them had been through absolute hell before they got to us.
Anti-Semitism was rife. Now Jews from all over Germany were seeking help from Frank Foley. In the summer of 1938, Adele Wertheimer travelled from Nuremberg to the consulate in Berlin.
My father was in the textile business, and he was particularly trading with farmers and taking orders from them, collecting and delivering. One day some local person was getting jealous of his business, and the case was trumped up against him, and he was arrested and sentenced to 1 year in prison. My mother was told that when people were released, the Jews were released from jail, now they were sent direct to concentration camps. And the advice she was given by the Jewish agency or lawyers or whoever was that she should get a permit to leave Germany. She was told the waiting list was for years, and there were priorities for this and for that. She was seen by Major Foley himself, and she explained the situation to him, and he said, "Well, I'll give you a certificate," as it was called, "for the sake of the child," which was myself. They came back the next day with the with life in their, you know, my mother had our life in her pocket, so to say. And there's no clearer way than to recognize that it was thanks to Major Foley.
Days later, Leopold Wertheimer was released from prison, and the family escaped by boat to Palestine. But for the Jews left behind, the worst was still to come. On November the 9th, 1938, stormtroopers ran amok after the murder of a German ambassador by a young Jew. The Nazis named it the Night of the Broken Glass, Kristallnacht.
I saw smoke on the way to school. Hitler youth were gathering outside carrying stones. So when I left the school, I followed the smoke and found that the synagogue in the Fasanenstraße had been set alight. It was burning, and crowds were opposite watching. And then I walked past the Tauentzienstraße, one of the main roads, and then I saw Jewish shops smashed and people outside jeering. When I got home, I found that our chauffeur Gerhard Brode had painted the pavement outside our house with a fair Jude, fair Jew.
We went to school as usual, and when we got there, at the gate we were told, "Go back quickly, don't talk to anybody, get onto the tram, go home, and stay there." And as we turned, we saw in the schoolyard books and benches and everything strewn all over the yard, and we also saw smoke. But I found out later that the smoke did not come from the school, but rather from the synagogue, which was on the same complex next to the school, and which had been set on fire.
My mother stood at the top of the stairs, absolutely terrified, frightened until everybody got home, and that was the most frightening night in my life. We were laying there all night long, waiting for somebody to bang at the door. They didn't ring the bell, they just almost smashed the doors in to come and ask for my father. But thank God the night went past and nothing happened.
Ruth and Werner's father, Richard Lax, was a company administrator in Cologne. He lost his job when his business became Aryanized. The heads of Jewish families were now being hunted down by the Nazis. For Frank Foley, the events of Kristallnacht confirmed his worst fears for the Jews.
Foley and his wife went out in their car and toured around Berlin, trying to do what they could to help. The day after Kristallnacht, Foley allowed German Jewish leaders to hold a press conference in his flat. But not only that, from that day onwards, Foley allowed people to stay in his flat, 4 or 5 people every night. His wife afterwards described how these people would come down in the morning, leaving little presents for her in gratitude for what Foley's had done.
My mother said to me, "Your father has gone to the country. We are going to go to the home of his boss, another Jewish gentleman, who had already been taken to concentration camp, and in that way there will be nobody at home, and if anybody comes for your father, they won't find him. And they won't go to the other people's home because he's already been taken to concentration camp." And we stayed there for about 2 or 3 nights, and then we went home, by which time things had settled down a little bit, and my father came back. And then for the next few months until our emigration, it was all making every effort for us to come out of the country. We were stuck. But our application was in Berlin, and there, one fine day, we received a letter from the British Passport Office in Berlin, addressed to my parents, "Please send your passports so that we can enter a visa." I remember this very well. I was 12 at the time, and on a Sunday morning this was, post in Germany came on a Sunday, and my friend was there, and we jumped up and down for joy, and in due course, in June 1939, I think it was, we left for England.
The Lax thought their visas had been sent by mistake because they had no one to support their application, but Foley was willing to defy the British authorities. He even went into concentration camps to get Jews out.
There was a queue, quite a long queue, almost every morning, of people waiting to get into the passport office, waiting for their visas. And the whole thing was just one bustle of activity and energy and quite a lot of fear. Quite a lot of, well, I think most of these people were at a loss to know whether they were going to get through or not. And I saw Captain Foley on a number of occasions going out and making sure they had a hot drink and making sure the commissioner was looking after them. He was that sort of a man. He cared for people.
He was a very nice man, very hopeful, very optimistic. It's such a change from those Nazis.
Inga's father, Oscar Fehr, was one of the few Jewish doctors given permission to practice in Britain, but their family's passports had been held back by the German authorities. Foley took the family to the front of the queue.
That day, the 6th of July 1939, was a day we met, and we had our visa stamped into our passport today. That day, and we could emigrate. We decided to go first class by the ship Bremen, because we had to leave all our money behind, except 10 marks each. But without Captain Foley, it mightn't have been speeded up, and we might have left it too late, because once war broke out on September the 1st, we wouldn't be allowed to leave. We would have been trapped in Germany. So I think Captain Foley probably saved all our lives.
This is getting very, very close to the war. He was collecting as much information as he could on the Germans. He was a spy who could have been arrested at any time, but he had no diplomatic immunity. Most civil servants, most Foreign Office diplomats abroad would have stuck rigidly to the rules. He took the rule book and really tore it to pieces, frankly.
Foley escaped Germany in August 1939, just as war broke out, then continued his spying activities in Norway. Later, he was posted to London, where he oversaw intelligence operations behind enemy lines. After Hitler's defeat in 1945, the world finally saw the true horror of the Nazis' atrocities. Foley saved thousands of lives, but he couldn't stop their suffering.
My aunt remained in Germany, and eventually she was sent to Treblinka concentration camp, where she died. As one gets older, it gets more difficult. It was easier, but it was... My aunt made a bad personal choice, if I can put it that way. I mean, she was going to go to the States, the United States in 1935 and 1936 with her fiancé, but then she met somebody else, and it broke up, and she signed her death warrant.
Foley retired to Stourbridge. He lived a very quiet life, pottering around in his garden, reading books, basically. And then, in 1958, one day, his wife decided to go out shopping. Foley hadn't felt very well. He thought he might go up and have a bath. She went out shopping. She came back. He was still apparently in the bath. And she went upstairs, and tragically, he'd had a heart attack and died alone. It was a very, very sad end for a man who'd done so much for so many people, that he should die with what he did, a virtual unknown in this country. No one, even now, really, there are very few people who know who Foley was and how many people he saved.
In 1959, a gathering of Foley's survivors in Jerusalem commemorated his achievements. But it took over 40 years for the Israeli authority, Yad Vashem, to give him the Righteous Among the Nations award. Britain has been slow to honour this unsung hero, but in his hometown of Highbridge, a group of residents, led by the local vicar, are planning their own statue to honour him.
Highbridge as a town doesn't have many heroes. This is an opportunity to remember a man from our community whose background, not dissimilar to many people who live here now today, actually is an inspiration. And Frank made a difference. And the number of people today who can trace their well-being, their lives back to his action is just a wonderful legacy.